This is Six Wine Stories number 24 from December 22, and this is the online version. My name is Robert Hunter. The inspiration for Six Wine Stories came from the cooperative in Pinell de Brai in the Terra Alta, where they have this little section of tiles on the facade which shows six guys sitting around telling stories and drinking wine. And that's mostly what we're going to be doing. Sitting around, telling stories, drinking wine. The inspiration this time, or the theme this time, is the Reconquest. I'll relate the Reconquest, or bits of the Reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula back in the beginning of the Middle Ages, and I'll relate that to different wineries who are, in their own way, recovering and reconquering different grape varieties, different areas, different techniques. So they're doing old-fashioned things in a new way. The inspiration for the whole idea comes from our friends at Bodegas Reconquista, which is a brand new winery down in Campo de Calatrava, which is in the south of La Mancha. So just before you get to Andalusia, they built this winery just a couple of years ago. And they're going to be, the theme for today is this, the Reconquest of Spain, how it went from being a Visigothic kingdom in the early 700s to being invaded by the Muslim armies in 711, who eventually got all the way up to Poitiers, and then another 700 years later were finally expelled, and you had the late medieval kingdoms of Castilla, Aragon, Navarra, and Portugal, covering the Iberian Peninsula. And that's all going to be explained using six wines, as always. A wine from Leon, from the northwest of Spain, a wine from the Penedès, from here in Catalonia, a Rioja, a Ribera Duero. The title wine for the evening is Reconquista, from Campo de Calatrava, which is, as I said, south of La Mancha. And then we have a wine from the Priorat, the Gran Predicat. So the first story comes from Leon, and the grape variety is Albarín, not Albarino, Albarín. Back in the 730s, the Muslims had conquered virtually all of the Iberian Peninsula, and there was just a tiny little bit of the northern mountainous coastline where the Christians were still dominating. Already by about 800, that border had come down to further south, and that includes this area of Leon. So Leon is not a very well-known denomination of origin. The city is better known. And we're in a town here called Gordoncillo, a little Gordon. And this is a town which built a winery in the beginning of the 2000s. The people of the village had all owned little bits of vineyard, as you can see on the photograph here. There's lots of land around the town, but that always used to be divided up into lots of little small plots, and they decided to concentrate all the vineyard and put it all into one company. And then at the top of the photograph here, you can see the the winery here with a little bit of vineyard outside, and they all built a winery together. So this is not so much a personal story as the whole village got together to build a winery. They replanted all of their vineyards, and they replanted them using traditional grape varieties from their region. So they're grape varieties which are not very well known outside of the region. The red variety is called Prieto Picudo, and even less well known is this grape variety called Albarín. As I said, it's not Albarino, it's a slightly different flavor profile, and it's a a grape variety which is, they only have 90 hectares planted in the whole world. And most of them are here at this winery called, they've called it Gordoncillo. The wine is called Peregrino. Peregrino meaning the pilgrim. Obviously, this is related to the Pilgrim's Way, the Camino de Santiago, which goes all the way across the top of Spain, which is related in some way to the resurgence of or the strengthening of the Christian religion in the early Middle Ages. People would walk all the way across the north of Spain without crossing any of the Muslim territories to get to Santiago de Compostela, and they would be called the Peregrinos, the pilgrims. The next story takes us to the Penedès. The Penedès was also an area which was recovered fairly quickly from the Arabs. They reached Poitiers in 732, and then on this side of the country, on the Mediterranean side, it was the Franks, under the Emperor Charlemagne, who eventually reconquered Barcelona in about 801. And even a couple of hundred years later, the situation hadn't changed very much. So you had, during almost 3 centuries, a fairly stable situation in this part of Catalonia. And people were going down to what is now the Penedès and already occupying it and planting it with vineyards. And we're looking at a vineyard here, which is in the northern part of the Penedès, close to the town of Saint-Sorny. Actually, it's a little village called Espièges. This is the owner of Vins al Cep. In fact, this is a project which 4 families started together in 1980. There are 4 families who owned old farmhouses. All of their roots go back, or the documents go back to the 1400s and the 1500s, which is another part of a historical discussion. That was after a civil war in which basically the people who worked the land became free from their lords who controlled the land before. And so instead of just working the land, they finally got to own the land. That was called La Guerra de las Remences, which happened in the 15th century here in Catalonia. So the families all got together, pulled out their land together, and started to grow grapes. As you can see, this is the Penedès. This is, as you come from Barcelona, it's the start of the Penedès. You go over the bridge at Martorell, and the next town you come to a Gelida, which is the town you can see in the background. So you've got a place which is fairly typical Mediterranean climate, and it's separated from the Mediterranean by the hills you can see in the background here. They're growing mostly traditional grape varieties, so grape varieties like Xarel, Parellada, Macabeu, which is the traditional grape varieties to make cava. But in recent times, they've been recovering a quite unusual grape variety called Xarel Vermell. In other words, it's a red Xarel. It's a very unusual sort of color, because normally you see there's a white Xarel and there's the rosé, they call it red, but it's really just a very, very light colored grape, which doesn't make red wine or rosé wine. It just makes white wine. The juice inside is purely white, and that's made in what they call an egg. It's fermented in concrete, and a little bit of the wine is aged in oak as well. But it makes a very fine, structured wine. And it's a very unusual grape variety for the Penedès, which has been recovered by Maite and her team at Vins al Cep. Here's the third story. We're going to go to Rioja now. So Rioja as you know, it's this little, if you look at the map here between Castile and Navarre, it's this little bit here. So it wasn't immediately reconquered by the Christians. It was still maintained under Arab rule. And if you come from Castile, you come over this this border here. The first river that you cross is the Rioja, which then gives its name to this whole region, which is coming down here. And we'll see that's what happens when it was conquered. At this time, the kingdom of Leon and the kingdom of Castile had joined together and were getting ever stronger. And at the same time, the Muslim empire had divided up into lots of little kingdoms, what's known in Spanish as reinos de taifas, which is one of the reasons why the Christians, as they went south, started to conquer individual little kingdoms. Anyway, they've conquered Rioja here by the year 1047. The wine that we're going to taste is a wine which is also a reconquering of an old grape variety, as the Albarín and the Xarel of Vermell. Here we're talking about a grape variety called Maturana. It's grown in this case, by Eduardo Arnaiz. Eduardo has a few different vineyards. The most famous is Finca La Emperatriz. And here is, in this photograph, is this year's vintage of the Finca La Emperatriz Tempranillo. And it's mostly a vineyard with very old vines. So it's a very stony soil. It's in one of the colder parts of Rioja Alta. And the Tempranillo is very well adapted to this estate. Maturana is a grape variety which is much less well known, and they began to plant again within the last 10 years or so. You'll see a couple of Maturana wines on the market, and Eduardo has planted these young vines you see here, and quite different type of grapes, a much smaller grape, a much more compact bunch. It seems to be related in some way to a Cabernet Sauvignon or a Cabernet Franc, certainly in terms of the shape of the grapes. So it's planted in a more modern style, and a lot of controls are made just before the harvest to make sure that the grapes have the right level of sugar and the right level of acidity. So it's the right moment to harvest. And they're not these grapes are not hand harvested, these are machine harvested to make sure that they're all picked at the same time with the same level of maturity. And you get a wine which is a little bit more astringent than a Tempranillo, but full of sort of more French style fruit. Now we're moving on to the Ribera Duero and a company called Oro de Castilla. So the Duero is the bottom edge of this frontier here. For many, many centuries, the Duero was the border between the Caliphate of Cordoba and the kingdoms in the north. And the area down here, just below the Duero, on other maps is shown as no man's land. So really, it was an area where nobody really wanted to live. It was too much conflict, so people stayed away. As it moved south, they started to take over areas south of the Duero, and they started to plant grapes in areas like Rueda, which is here. So if we look at this map here, Rueda is down here. And our friend Pablo de Villar is a guy from Rueda. He's actually standing in a Rueda vineyard here now, and his main business is making white wines from Rueda, but his wife is also a winemaker, and that family story is that his grandfather actually owned a small piece of land to the north of the Duero. But it was a very good piece of land, a very, very valuable, because it was very, very productive. And his grandfather decided to sell that small piece of land for a much larger piece of land south of the Duero in Rioja, and plant with vineyards. It's a very poor soil, but it's a much larger piece of land. So through having more land, they established their own vineyards and managed to start to sell the Oro Castilla Rueda actually quite well. In the last few years, Pablo has re-established himself back north, so he's reconquered northwards in this case, and he's planted in around Aranda de Duero, and grows his Oro de Castilla red wine in the Ribera. This is just a couple of photographs from the region of Rioja. This is an underground cellar. So when the region of Rioja was reconquered from the Muslims, to begin with, people didn't populate. They just planted grapes and had an underground cellar to keep the wine. But the monks who had planted this vineyard actually stayed north of the River Duero. They just planted the grapes, grew the wine there, and then took it back to the monastery on the other side of the river. And there's the monastery at San Bernardo there. And now Pablo has these beautiful vineyards in Aranda, growing Tinto Fino. So this is the grape variety which is used to make the Oro Castilla, classic Ribera variety, 100% Tinto Fino. So we come to our title story, the people from Campo de Calatrava, Bodega Reconquista. As the south of Spain became many individual, smaller and weaker kingdoms, the Christians from around 1095 started to really push south very quickly. And there was, around this time, there wasn't really a border so much as an area of conflict which was to the south of La Mancha down here. There was a big battle in Toledo in 1095. And then other battles where the frontier moved back and forth, and it wasn't really settled until 1212 with the Battle of Navas de Tolosa, which is one of the major battles to re-establish the Christian control in the Iberian Peninsula. So down here, you've got by the 1100s the area which is now known as the Campo de Calatrava. At that time, it wasn't called the Campo de Calatrava because the order of the Calatrava knights, they were a religious military order, I suppose inspired by the Crusades. During the Crusades, there were military orders like the Knights Templar who were set up to protect travelers to the Holy Land. Once the Crusaders had conquered the Holy Lands again, lots of people wanted to go on pilgrimage to the Holy Lands instead of going to Santiago de Compostela, where pilgrimage started in the 9th century. In the 11th century, people started to go on pilgrimages to the Holy Land, and the Knights Templar was set up almost like a travel agency to permit and to protect travelers to the Holy Land. Within Spain, you had a lot of these military orders then arose around the end of the 12th century. So the Orden de Calatrava, Orden de Santiago is another one. And they were the equivalent of the Taliban, sort of religious military orders who would conquer and then keep the territory for themselves, sort of more or less in agreement with the king, or maybe not. They were soldiers of fortune, but with a religious bent to it as well. So this is now called the Campo de Calatrava and Ciudad Real, is the king's city, the royal city, which was named that after it was reconquered in the 13th century. So we've got a wine here from Fernando, is a guy who's planted a huge extension of organic vineyards. Here is Alfonso X, who was the guy who reconquered the city of Xarel, and this is the winery that we saw before, a brand new winery built a couple of years ago, based on. So a lot of wines are made from people who have vineyards and want to make wine. This company has a very unusual beginning because they started out by selling machinery. Their business, or their original business, is in machinery for the food industry. So machinery to pump liquids, to filter liquids, to move liquids from one place to another. And they started out in the milk business and gradually graduated towards the wine business and set up a small winery, largely to show off their machinery, and discovered little by little that if they worked with people who had good vineyards like Fernando, they could also make very good wine. So step by step, they've gone from a machinery company into a wine company with these extensive vineyards throughout the Campo de Calatrava. The other thing to point out about the Campo de Calatrava is if you look at the color of the soil here, it's a quite different color. It's a sort of almost winey color. It's got a purpley brown tint to it, and that is because this area is volcanic. These are all old volcanoes and old lava fields many millions of years ago, and that gives them their special color and their special quality for making wine. This is Syrah, which has been aged for 18 months in barrels of oak. And the final story is our old friend Rouget from the Priorat. The Priorat comes last in this whole story because it's right up here in the north. And you'd say, well, how come that was never conquered? It's never conquered because it's very mountainous, very isolated. The soil is very poor. Nobody really wanted to conquer it because it wasn't really worth very much. So it was one of the last places, certainly the last place in Catalonia. But the Christians coming south didn't conquer it until the middle of the 12th century. And it was finally conquered and became part of the kingdom, the Aragon. And now by the middle of the 13th century, you've got a fairly stable series of kingdoms across the north of Spain. This is our friend Rouget, whose family have lived in the Priorat for at least 5 generations. He doesn't have documents going further back, but that's 5 generations. And they live in the village of El Molar, which straddles what's called the Montsant and the Priorat. So half of their land is in the Priorat, and a lot more than half is outside. So I have a little bit of land in the Priorat, and they farm a lot more land in the Montsant region. This is what the Priorat looks like from the north. So you can see it's a very, very mountainous area, difficult to get to, and militarily very, very difficult to conquer. So it took a long time for the Christians to conquer it. And when they did, so that was looking from the north. This is looking from the south. You can see right over here in the background. That's the hermit, the chapel at Syrah is right in the background there. And when it was conquered, it was turned over to the church, which is why it's called the Priorat now, because they built a monastery at Scala, and they either farmed themselves or rented the land out to the local farmers to farm the land in this area called the Priorat. So it belonged to the prior of the monastery of Scala. And obviously, you're talking about pilgrimage. A lot of people came from the outside as well to to recover the Priorat. So the Priorat, Roger is one of the unusual people because his family's always been there. But the Priorat, the big boom in Priorat has come since 1986, when people from outside of the Priorat, people from all over the world, there are South Africans, French people, Germans, English people from all over come to the Priorat to try and make the best wine that they can with this fantastic soil and fantastic grapes. So it's often a collaboration between the white hands of the people coming from outside and the black hands of the people who work the land. And finally, this is a wine which is made mostly from Carignana, from very old Carignana vines that belonged to Roger's family at the south end of the Priorat. So by the end of the 13th century, Christians have pushed south. They've virtually covered the whole of the Iberian Peninsula, just leaving the Kingdom of Granada, which they would chip away at for the next 200 years or so, until finally in 1492 the rest of the land is integrated into the Kingdom of Castile. And that's where you have it. Those are the wines that we've tasted, and hope you enjoyed it.